Hello, my name is Claire. I'm 18 years old, and today we're going to be reading All My Patients Have Tails, um, Favorite Stories from a Vet's Practice by Jeff Wells. And today's chapter is Feline Frenzy. All right, let's get started. Mrs. Perkins was methodically explaining the symptoms that her new cat, Henry, was experiencing. Although she hadn't had him long enough to know him well, she said it was obvious he wasn't feeling up to par. Mrs. Perkins was a vibrant blonde in her early 30s, with a typical Norwegian Dakota accent. Her husband traveled a lot for his job, and she was elated to have a fuzzy new companion. She looked me up and down skeptically, clearly evaluating the new guy on the block. I had been out of veterinary school for only a few months. I'm sure it was more apparent than I would have wanted to admit that I was still a little nervous about every case that walked through the door, afraid that I might not be able to handle the situation, or that I might misdiagnose the ailment of a beloved pet. I just picked him up from the Humane Society 2 days ago and he was fine then, don't you know? Miss Perkins began. Then last night he began to howl when you went to use the litter box. It was the most horrible noise I'd ever heard a kitty make. You've just got to help him. Even though I was a novice, I had a pretty good idea what was afflicting the recently adopted feline. Do you know why he ended up at the Humane Society, Mrs. Perkins? She pondered for a moment before responding. You betcha. I remember now. They said he was urinating on the owner's carpet the last couple weeks. These were the classic signs of a urinary infection, and the howling indicated that a bladder stone was now blocking Henry's urethra, making it nearly impossible for him to empty his bladder. I would need to palpate the bladder to see how full it was and take an x-ray to determine the exact location of the blockage. Henry was still in the blue plastic carrier that Miss Perkins brought him in. I set it on the Formica exam table between us. I opened the metal gate door and began to ease my hand in to get hold of the patient. My hand was almost to the cat's head when his new owner remembered an important piece of information. Oh, doctor, I almost forgot. Henry's practically feral. You can't pet him or pick him up. I had to coax him into the terrier with food and slam the door. This was definitely information I could have used earlier. Now I stood frozen, with my arm elbow deep in the cage of an uncivil feline. On instinct, my hand began to pull back, but it was too late. A sharp pain shot up my arm, and the familiar sensation of warm blood washed over my palm. Henry had sunk his teeth into my index finger. A white, furry tornado then spun out the door of the carrier, tearing at my forearm as it made an escape. Henry hit the floor at a dead run and slid on the linoleum tile as he rounded the corner, disappearing through the doorway of the exam room. Still in shock from my own injuries, I bent over, holding my damaged limb against my abdomen, and held back words that would be unacceptable in rural South Dakota. Mrs. Perkins began to tear up. Oh, Henry, please don't let him get hurt or escape outdoors, she pleaded. He's so fragile. This statement brought me back to my senses, and I began to imagine how upset Mrs. Perkins would be if Henry did manage to make it out, or got hurt trying. I took off after the frightened feline, temporarily forgetting my shredded hand. Henry had made it into the reception area and immediately started climbing the curtains. Determined to bolt, he seemed to have reached a maximum level of hysteria, spewing excrement randomly as he scurried from drape to drape. The question I frantically pondered was how to get a hold of the frightened cat without exciting him even more or losing a limb in the process. While I stood in the middle of the room, wondering why this situation had never been described to me in veterinary school, he made a full circle by using the curtain rides as a trapeze set, then disappeared into the next room. Miss Perkins yelped as Henry streaked by her in the hallway and made for the laboratory, the one room with the most potential for damage by an overstimulated kitty. Following the trail of rancid diarrhea and wondering how the intestinal tract of just one 10-pound cat could possibly produce so much, I followed him onto the lab. By this point, I felt sure that Henry was displaying some as yet discovered biologic mechanism that generated an infinite amount of fecal matter, because it now blanketed the once pristine countertops and sterile instruments of the room. The only good news was that he had decided to take a hiatus behind the autoclave and was now peering out at me from behind it. His pupils were wide open with fear, and the backs of his eyes reflected the fluorescent lighting, giving them a greenish-yellow glow. He sat still as a statue, like young deer or rabbits when approached in the deep grass, seeming to be alive. If I don't move, the human won't see me. Now I had to decide how I could get a hold of Henry without making the room even more of a disaster zone. For lack of a more brilliant plan, I turned to the basics. Kitty, 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 I called, trying to sound as loving as possible under the circumstances. It didn't work. These words only seemed to alert the frozen feline that I could actually see him, jolting him back into action across the countertop. "Oh, no, not those!" I hollered, but it was too late. The 30-plus blood tubes that we had worked so hard to get from the unwilling 200-pound pigs the previous afternoon crashed to the floor with just a little shove from Henry. It had taken hours to extract the blood for viral testing. My inexperience, combined with the determination of the hefty swine, had provided a year's worth of entertainment for the farmer and his neighbors. Now I would have to call him, explain the situation, and endure the ridicule of another trip to the farm. I could already picture the scene. Even more locals would be invited this time. Chairs would probably be set up and maybe even tickets sold. But first, I still had to retrieve this cat. I decided then that I had enough. Henry made for the door to exit the lab, but I stood my ground. This time he hesitated, giving me that crucial split second. I dived and scooped him up, keeping his glistening white teeth at bay. He wiggled and clawed at me, making his way up my shoulder. Then he abruptly stopped moving and appeared to relax. He was hanging by one claw from my earlobe. The razor-sharp claws had punctured the fleshy portion of my ear deeply enough to support his weight. I don't know if he had finally given up from exhaustion or just decided to claim victory, but it seemed that someone had turned off his switch. When Mrs. Perkins found us, her reaction was not what I might have wished. Instead of saying, "I'm so sorry, doctor. Are you okay?" she said, "Oh, you haven't injured my Henry, have you?" With the feline still attached to my ear, blood running down my neck, and Mrs. Perkins scolding me about a proper pet restraint, I began to reflect on what exactly had brought me to this point. 8 years of strenuous college curriculum, national board exams, and a huge student loan debt all added up to this glamorous title of veterinarian, which I had coveted for most of my life. I wondered what my friends from college were doing now. Probably sitting in plush offices making big bucks and wondering with clients who didn't regularly bite them. I guessed. Yet I really do enjoy this sometimes crazy career choice of mine, and I can't imagine not having chosen it, even though I'm not always appreciated by the owner or the patient. Removing Henry from my ear, I carried him back into the exam room, where the whole fiasco had begun. Once he was on the table, he continued to appear relaxed and fairly normal. Mrs. Perkins held on to him while I slipped a sedative in his rear leg. I don't know if he felt better or he was just out of the fight, but he put up with me. The sedative took over in a few minutes, allowing me to pass a urinary catheter to relieve any blockage. He went home with antibiotics and a change of diet to help prevent any recurrence. So why did I decide to become a veterinarian? It isn't an easy path. It requires years of hard work just to get that DVM degree and a diploma to hang on a wall, followed by long hours for moderate compensation once you've got a wall to hang it on. To explain myself, I think I'd better start from the beginning. And that's all we have for today's chapter. Thank you so much. Sorry for any flubs of the mouth. And I'm looking forward to reading the next chapter.